There is a strange moment you may have experienced before, not when everything falls apart, but when everything seems fine. You wake up, your body feels healthy, life shows no obvious problems. Yet somewhere inside, there is a subtle tension that is hard to name. Not pain, not sadness, not fear in the old sense, just a feeling as if you are quietly monitoring yourself. You start noticing whether you are still in the right state today, whether your breath is deep enough, whether this emotion might pull you down, whether this tiredness is a signal to rest or a sign that you are going the wrong way. And then a familiar thought appears, not loud, not dramatic, just very soft. What if I let go a little? You do not dare to let go, not because you want to control life, but because you have touched a very high state before, very clear, very calm, and you do not want to lose it. At some point, you begin living as if you are balancing on a thin wire, afraid to get too tired, afraid to feel too much sadness, afraid to drift, because you fear that one small slip and everything will fall. You wonder whether you are doing it right or whether you are forcing it. But you do not look too deeply, because if the answer is that you are forcing it, then you would not know how to let go without losing everything. Maybe you still meditate, still observe, still stay present. But somewhere, the original lightness has turned into a quiet obligation to maintain, to stay right, to stay okay. And in the silence, a question begins to form that you have never dared to say out loud. What if the real fear is not returning to your old life, but losing the state you just touched? If that question feels like it touches something inside you, then perhaps this video did not arrive by accident. You did not arrive here at the beginning of the journey, and you are not at the end either. You are somewhere in between, a place that rarely gets named clearly because it does not look dramatic from the outside. Nothing is collapsing, nothing is exploding. Your life may even look more stable than before, but inside there is a quiet shift that makes everything feel slightly unfamiliar. The tools that once helped no longer feel as effective. The effort that once brought clarity now feels heavy, and the silence that once felt peaceful now feels strangely tense. This is not because something is wrong. It is because you have crossed a line that most people never notice. A line that does not announce itself with fireworks or suffering. It arrives quietly, almost politely. You only realize it after you are already standing on the other side. Before this point, the journey felt directional. You were moving away from something, away from pain, away from confusion, away from the old version of yourself. There was momentum, there was motivation, there was a sense of progress. Even the practices had a clear purpose. You breathed to calm the mind. You observed to detach from thought. You focused to raise your state, and it worked. You felt lighter, clearer, more present. Something inside you finally exhaled. For the first time, you experienced yourself not as the noise in your head, but as the space around it. That moment changed everything. But what happens after that moment is rarely discussed, because it does not fit the usual story of awakening or transformation. There is no clear enemy anymore, no obvious problem to fix, yet the system inside you does not fully relax. Instead, it becomes alert in a new way, more refined, more subtle. You are no longer fighting chaos. You are trying to preserve clarity. And without realizing it, your attention shifts from living to maintaining. This is the invisible threshold. Not a breakdown, not a breakthrough, a recalibration point where the old strategies stop working, but the new way has not revealed itself yet. You still remember how it felt to be fully aligned, so you begin to check yourself, not obsessively, just gently at first. Am I still present? Am I still open? Am I still there? And every time you ask the question, the body tightens just a little, because now presence has become something you can lose. What makes this stage confusing is that it feels like responsibility, like maturity, like commitment to the path. You are not doing anything wrong on the surface. You are careful, attentive, disciplined, but underneath there is a subtle pressure to stay in the right state, to not fall back, to not undo what took you so long to reach. And this pressure does not come from fear in the old sense. It comes from memory, from knowing what is possible and not wanting to forget it. At this point, many people think they need better techniques, deeper practices, stronger discipline, more awareness. But the problem is not lack of skill. It is that the journey has quietly changed direction. Before, you were moving forward. Now, you are being asked to settle, to integrate, to let the system reorganize itself without interference. And that feels uncomfortable because it looks like nothing is happening. The mind does not like that. It wants signs, confirmation, progress markers. So it creates a new task. Stay high, stay clear, stay aligned. The body, however, receives a different signal. It senses that something needs to slow down, that the nervous system needs space, that the constant self-monitoring is creating tension instead of coherence. But because there is no language for this stage, many people misinterpret these signals. Fatigue becomes a sign of failure. Emotional waves become proof of regression. Neutrality becomes emptiness. And rest becomes a risk. This is why this video appears when it does. Not because you need new information, but because you are standing at a point where understanding alone is no longer enough. You are being invited into a different relationship with the process, one that does not rely on effort or control, one that trusts the intelligence of the system to find its own equilibrium. But to accept that invitation, you first have to recognize where you are, not behind, not ahead, just at a threshold that cannot be crossed by trying harder. If you feel like you are doing everything right, yet something feels slightly off, if the idea of letting go feels both relieving and frightening, if you sense that the next shift will not come from pushing but from allowing, then this is not a coincidence. This is the moment where the journey stops being about reaching a state and starts becoming about living from it without holding on. Everything still looks fine from the outside. Your routine has not collapsed. Your relationships have not exploded. Your work continues. Your days still move forward in a familiar rhythm. If someone were to ask how you are doing, you could honestly say you are okay. And yet inside there is a quiet contradiction that keeps growing harder to ignore. You are not falling apart, but you are no longer at ease. Not restless in the old way, not anxious in the obvious way, just subtly unsettled, as if something that used to carry you effortlessly is now asking for constant attention. This stage is difficult to describe because nothing is clearly wrong. There is no dramatic trigger, no visible crisis. In fact, it often appears after things have improved, after you have let go of old patterns, after you have gained insight, after you have felt what clarity feels like. That is what makes it confusing. You expected more peace, more stability, more ease. Instead, you find yourself checking in with your inner state more than ever before, not because you are lost, but because you are afraid of losing what you found. You notice it in small moments, a quiet self-scan when you wake up, a subtle question during the day. Am I still present? Am I still aligned? Am I doing this right? The questions do not feel aggressive. They feel responsible, mature, almost wise. But each time they appear, the body tightens just a little. The breath becomes slightly shallower, the chest slightly guarded. And without realizing it, you begin living with a background tension that never fully turns off. You are no longer chasing happiness or success or validation. Those older struggles feel distant now. Instead, the new concern is internal, more refined, You worry about your state, about slipping back, about losing clarity, about missing some invisible signal. And because this concern is subtle, it hides behind good intentions. You tell yourself you are simply being mindful, attentive, conscious, but something in the system knows the difference between awareness and vigilance, and it is responding accordingly. At first, you may think this is just part of the process, that maybe integration feels like this, that maybe this is what growth requires. So you push through gently, you maintain your practices, you observe more carefully, you correct yourself when emotions arise, you remind yourself to stay open, to stay calm, to stay high. And on the surface, this works. You do not crash, you do not spiral, but you also do not relax. There is no full exhale, no sense of being done for the day, because the work never quite ends. This is where the confusion deepens. You are not suffering in a way that justifies stopping. You are functioning. You are aware. You are not lost. So why does something feel off? Why does rest feel slightly unsafe? Why does neutrality feel like something is missing? Why does silence no longer feel spacious but expectant? These questions rarely form clearly. They sit under the surface as a vague sense that you are holding something together all the time. What is happening here is not a failure of progress. It is a shift in the role you are playing within your own system. Earlier in the journey, there was effort directed outward. You were working through patterns, understanding triggers, releasing old narratives. The effort made sense because there was something to resolve. But now the effort has turned inward. You are monitoring the very state that once arose naturally, and that changes the relationship completely. When awareness becomes something you have to maintain, it stops being a resting place and starts becoming a task. The body feels this immediately, even if the mind frames it as growth. Even if the story sounds spiritual, the nervous system does not respond to concepts. It responds to signals. And the signal it is receiving now is that safety depends on performance, on staying in the right state, on not letting go too much. This is why you may feel tired in a way that sleep does not fix, why moments of joy feel slightly fragile, why emotional waves feel more threatening than before. It is not because you have regressed. It is because the margin for error feels smaller. You believe you have something to protect. And protection always comes with tension. Many people at this stage quietly judge themselves. They think they should be more stable by now, more grounded, more at peace. They compare their current experience with a memory of how it once felt and conclude that something has gone wrong. But that comparison is misleading because the earlier clarity came before the fear of losing it existed. And now that fear is part of the equation. Even if it is never spoken, you might notice that the idea of doing nothing feels uncomfortable, not boring, risky, as if without active presence something might slip. You may catch yourself correcting your inner state mid-conversation, adjusting your tone, softening reactions, pulling yourself back into alignment. Again, none of this looks wrong. It looks conscious. But consciousness that is driven by fear does not feel free. It feels careful. There is also a subtle loneliness here, not because you are disconnected from others, but because this experience is hard to share. If you say you are tired, people may not understand. If you say you feel off, they may point to how far you have come, and they are not wrong. You have come far, but they are missing the nuance. The issue is not how far you are from the past. It is how tightly you are holding the present. This is the moment when many people double down. They look for new frameworks, new explanations, new models, something to reassure them that this tension is temporary and that they are still on track. But reassurance does not dissolve what is happening because the root is not doubt, it is control. Very quiet control. wrapped in awareness, disguised as discipline. The paradox is that the more you try to stabilize the state, the less stable it feels. Not because stability is impossible, but because true stability does not come from holding. It comes from allowing the system to move through natural fluctuations without interpretation. But at this stage, interpretation has become automatic. Every shift is measured, every dip is questioned, every pause is evaluated, and that constant evaluation prevents the nervous system from settling. So when everything is still okay, but you are no longer okay, it does not mean something is broken. It means the strategy that brought you here is no longer the one that will carry you forward. The discomfort you feel is not a warning sign. It is a signal that the journey is asking for a different quality of relationship. One that does not depend on maintaining a state, but trusting the process that allowed it to arise in the first place. This stage is quiet, unremarkable, easy to dismiss. But it is also one of the most important transitions, because this is where many people unknowingly turn awareness into effort and freedom into responsibility. And unless this is seen clearly, the path that once felt expansive slowly becomes heavy. Not because the truth is lost, but because it is being held too tightly. There is a moment when you begin to realize that you are no longer simply living your life, you are managing it. Not in the obvious ways like schedules or responsibilities, but in a much subtler layer. You are managing your inner state. You are monitoring how you feel. You are adjusting yourself constantly without ever calling it effort. It feels natural at first, responsible even. You tell yourself this is what awareness looks like. This is what integration requires. And yet something in you never fully rests. You might notice that you rarely let yourself fully collapse into rest anymore. Even when you lie down, your attention stays slightly alert. You remain aware of your breath, of your posture, of your inner tone. It is not uncomfortable enough to stop you, but it is present enough that true relaxation feels unfamiliar, as if rest now has conditions, as if you can only relax if you are doing it consciously. This is how pressure enters without being recognized as pressure. It does not shout, it whispers. It tells you that staying aligned is important, that consistency matters, that slipping back would be a waste of everything you have learned. And because these thoughts sound reasonable, they are rarely questioned. You do not experience them as fear. You experience them as care. But the body experiences them differently. The body does not understand narratives about growth or consciousness. It responds only to signals of safety or threat. And constant self-monitoring, no matter how gentle, sends a signal that something needs to be watched, something needs to be maintained. Something could go wrong if attention drops. Over time, this creates a low-grade stress that blends into the background. You may not feel anxious in the traditional sense, your thoughts are not racing, your emotions are not overwhelming, but the nervous system remains slightly activated. The sympathetic response never fully turns off, and because this activation is subtle, you adapt to it. You call it normal. You forget what ease actually feels like. This is where the idea of holding a high state quietly turns against itself. A state that originally emerged through openness and relaxation now seems to require effort to sustain. And the more you try to keep it, the more fragile it feels. You become sensitive to fluctuations. A tired day feels like a setback. A heavy emotion feels like a warning sign. A neutral mood feels suspicious. At this stage, many people begin to measure themselves internally, not consciously, but habitually. They check how present they are, how calm, how expanded, how clear, and every measurement creates a comparison. Every comparison creates tension. Because the present moment is never exactly the same as the remembered one, and memory becomes the standard. What is rarely seen is that the remembered state was never meant to be a permanent baseline. It was a glimpse, an opening, a demonstration of what is possible when the system is not interfering with itself. But once that glimpse is turned into a goal, the relationship changes. What was once spontaneous becomes something to protect, and protection always brings contraction. You might notice that joy feels slightly monitored now. You enjoy moments, but you also watch them as if checking whether they are deep enough, stable enough, real enough. You may even notice a subtle disappointment when a moment passes without leaving a strong imprint, as if it did not count, as if it did not confirm that you are still on the right track. This creates an inner environment where experience is no longer enough. It has to mean something. It has to signal progress. And when experience is filtered through meaning, the simplicity of being here is lost. The mind becomes busy in a new way, not with stories of lack or fear, but with stories of alignment and coherence. Ironically, this is often when people feel further away from themselves than before. Not because they are less aware, but because awareness has become conditional. They are present, but only in a certain way. They are open, but only as long as nothing disturbs the state. They are calm, but only as long as effort is applied. The body begins to protest quietly, through fatigue, through heaviness, through a sense of dullness that does not lift with motivation, through a longing to stop doing anything at all. But because these signals do not match the narrative of growth, they are often ignored or reframed. Fatigue becomes resistance. Heaviness becomes density clearing. Dullness becomes a phase to push through. This is where the pressure becomes truly invisible, because it is no longer experienced as pressure. It is experienced as duty, as commitment to the path, as responsibility to your own evolution. And questioning it feels almost irresponsible, as if letting go would undo everything. But look closely at what is actually being held. It is not truth. It is not awareness. It is an image of how awareness should feel, a remembered frequency, a particular configuration of the nervous system. And life does not stay in configurations. It moves. It oscillates. It breathes. When you try to freeze one moment, you create friction with that movement. The paradox is that the state you are trying to hold cannot be held by the one who wants to hold it. It arises when effort is absent, when monitoring stops, when the system is allowed to self-regulate. And yet this is exactly what feels unsafe now, because letting go feels like falling backward, like giving up control at the edge of something important. So you stay suspended, not miserable, not free, functional but tense, aware but tired, present but guarded. And because nothing is visibly wrong, you may stay here for a long time, convincing yourself that this is just how it is now, that this is the price of consciousness. That depth requires vigilance, but depth does not require vigilance. It requires trust, and trust cannot coexist with constant checking. One cancels the other out. As long as you are checking whether you are okay, the system receives the message that it might not be, and so it stays alert, it stays tight, it stays ready. This is why the pressure does not resolve through more understanding. You already understand enough. The issue is not insight, it is relationship. The relationship between awareness and control, between presence and fear, between the desire to stay open and the fear of closing again. Until this relationship shifts, the system will continue to oscillate between moments of clarity and moments of tension, and each oscillation will reinforce the belief that something needs to be managed, that the state is fragile, that vigilance is required. But this belief is the very thing preventing stability, not because stability is a static state, but because it is a dynamic balance that only emerges when interference stops, when the body is trusted to move through its own rhythms, when awareness is allowed to be spacious rather than strategic. This chapter is not here to tell you to stop caring or to abandon what you have learned. It is here to help you notice something subtle but crucial. That what feels like discipline may actually be fear, that what feels like awareness may actually be control, and that the pressure you feel is not a sign that you are failing. It is a sign that you are holding something that was never meant to be held. Once this is seen clearly, the next question naturally arises. If holding is the problem, then what does letting go actually mean? Not as an idea, but as a lived shift. Not as passivity, but as a different kind of participation. That question does not need to be answered yet. It only needs to be allowed, because recognizing the pressure is the first step toward releasing it. At some point, the idea of letting go begins to appear in your awareness, not as a clear instruction, more like a quiet suggestion. A sense that maybe you are holding too much, that maybe the tension you feel is not something to fix, but something to release. But the moment this idea surfaces, it is often followed immediately by resistance. Not loud resistance, rational resistance. Carefully worded objections that sound reasonable and even wise. If I let go, I might fall back. If I stop monitoring myself, I might lose clarity. If I relax too much, I might undo the work. These thoughts feel protective. They feel like intelligence guarding progress. And because they are subtle, they often go unquestioned.
You may even feel a small sense of guilt for wanting to let go, as if rest is laziness, as if ease is indulgence, as if surrender is secretly quitting.
This is where one of the deepest misunderstandings of the journey takes root. The belief that effort is what keeps you awake, that vigilance is what prevents collapse. That consciousness must be actively maintained or it will disappear. This belief does not come from ignorance. It comes from memory, from remembering how it once felt to be lost and not wanting to return there. So when the body asks for softness, the mind hears danger. When the system wants to slow down, the narrative says, be careful. And when the idea of letting go appears, it is immediately framed as regression, as losing ground, as stepping backward after coming so far. What makes this especially confusing is that earlier stages of the journey did require effort. You did have to interrupt patterns. You did have to observe thoughts. You did have to choose differently. Effort played a role. Discipline mattered. And because of that success, the mind assumes that effort will always be the answer, that more awareness will solve every problem, that doing more of what worked before will work again. But the context has changed. Earlier, effort was applied to unconscious patterns. Now, effort is being applied to consciousness itself. And that changes the effect completely. What once liberated now constricts. What once clarified now tightens. Not because effort is wrong, but because it is no longer appropriate for this phase. The body feels this immediately. That is why the call to let go does not come as an idea, but as a sensation, as fatigue, as heaviness, as a quiet desire to stop trying altogether. But because there is no framework for this sensation, it is misinterpreted. Fatigue becomes weakness. Heaviness becomes resistance. Wanting to stop becomes avoidance. So instead of listening, the mind pushes back. It reframes, it spiritualizes, it finds reasons to continue. You tell yourself you just need to be more consistent, more disciplined, more committed. And for a while this works. You maintain appearances, you function, you do not fall apart. But something essential is missing. The sense of being at home in yourself. Letting go is misunderstood because it is associated with collapse, with giving up, with losing direction. But true letting go is not collapse. It is release of unnecessary control. It is the difference between dropping the wheel and removing the white knuckle grip. The direction does not disappear, the movement continues, but the effort softens. The fear that arises around letting go reveals something important. It shows you where identity has attached itself to a state, where being awake has become something you are rather than something you are aware of. And Anything that becomes identity feels dangerous to loosen, because identity feels like survival. This is why letting go often feels like standing at the edge of something with no clear guarantee. The mind asks, what happens if I stop? Who will I be if I am not holding this together? How will I know I am still awake? These are not intellectual questions. They are existential, and they deserve respect, but they cannot be answered from the same level that is asking them. The irony is that what you are afraid of losing is not actually held by effort. The clarity you touched did not arise because you were trying hard enough. It arose when trying stopped for a moment, when the system relaxed enough to reorganize itself. That moment was not produced. It was allowed, and what is allowed cannot be preserved through force. But memory interferes here. Memory tells you what it felt like, and memory creates comparison, and comparison creates desire, and desire creates effort. This entire loop happens quietly, almost automatically, and before you realize it, the present moment is no longer being lived. It is being evaluated against a remembered one. This is where the fear of letting go becomes strongest, because letting go would mean allowing the present to be whatever it is without checking whether it matches the past. It would mean trusting that the system knows how to move even when you are not directing it. And that trust feels risky when you have spent so long believing that awareness requires supervision. You may notice that the idea of doing nothing feels uncomfortable, not because you are bored, but because you do not know who you are without the task of maintaining. The role of observer has become active rather than receptive. You are watching in order to ensure something, and without that purpose, watching feels empty. This is the subtle difference between awareness and management. Awareness sees, management monitors. Awareness is spacious. Management is narrow. Awareness allows fluctuation. Management resists it. And when awareness is mistaken for management, the entire experience changes texture. It becomes effortful. It becomes tiring. It becomes fragile. Letting go does not mean you stop being aware. It means awareness stops being used as a tool. It returns to being a space, a context, rather than an activity. And this shift cannot be forced, because forcing it would be another form of control. It can only happen when the fear around letting go is seen clearly rather than argued with. This is why the body plays such an important role here. The body is not confused about what letting go means. It knows the difference between tension and ease, between holding and allowing, between safety and threat. And it has been sending signals for a while now, signals that something is being overmanaged, that the system needs room. But because the mind is afraid, it does not trust these signals. It interprets them as obstacles rather than guidance. It assumes the body wants comfort while the path requires discipline. It creates a false opposition between embodiment and awareness, as if the two are separate, as if listening to the body would somehow lower the frequency. In reality, the opposite is true. Coherence emerges when the body is allowed to regulate itself, when signals are trusted, when rest is not negotiated, when emotion is not corrected, when neutrality is not questioned. This does not lead to collapse, it leads to integration. But integration does not feel like elevation, it feels like settling. And settling is often mistaken for stagnation by a mind addicted to peaks. The mind likes expansion, it likes intensity, it likes experiences that feel meaningful. Settling feels ordinary, unremarkable, and that ordinariness is deeply threatening to an identity built around awakening. So the fear of letting go is not really about losing awareness. It is about losing a certain self-image, the image of being someone who is awake, who is doing the work, who is staying high. Letting go threatens that image, and without the image, the ego does not know how to orient itself. This is why letting go cannot be a decision made by the ego. It has to be a recognition that the ego is not the one holding awareness in the first place. Awareness was never dependent on effort. It was simply uncovered when effort relaxed, and it remains when effort is no longer needed. But this recognition does not arrive through argument. It arrives through exhaustion, through seeing that holding does not bring safety, through feeling the cost of constant vigilance, through realizing that the fear of collapse is creating the very tension that feels like instability. When this becomes clear, letting go stops looking like failure. It starts looking like relief, not dramatic relief, quiet relief. The kind that does not announce itself, just a small softening, a slightly deeper breath, a moment where nothing needs to be checked. And that moment is often followed by another fear. What if this is it? What if this simplicity is all there is? No fireworks, no confirmation, no peak, just this. And that fear is the final gate. Because simplicity is where the mind has nothing to hold on to, and where awareness finally becomes free again. This chapter does not ask you to let go yet. It asks you to notice how letting go has been framed in your system as danger, as loss, as failure, and to question whether that framing is true, not intellectually, but experientially. By feeling what happens when you stop managing for just a moment, when you allow the system to breathe without supervision, that moment may feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, but it is not wrong. It is simply unguarded, and unguarded is where integration begins. At some point, the tension you have been carrying begins to express itself more clearly through the body, not as pain that demands immediate attention, not as illness that forces you to stop, but as a collection of subtle signals that do not fit neatly into the story you have been telling yourself. You wake up tired even after sleeping. Your chest feels slightly tight for no clear reason. Your breath does not drop as deeply as it used to unless you consciously guide it. Your body feels present but not settled, as if it is waiting for permission to stand down. These sensations are easy to ignore at first because they are not dramatic. You can still function, you can still think clearly, you can still meditate, you can still show up. And because nothing is obviously wrong, you assume this is just part of the process. A temporary adjustment, a phase to move through. But the body is not experiencing this as a phase. It is experiencing it as a prolonged state of readiness. The body does not understand spiritual narratives. It does not respond to ideas about growth or awakening. It responds to